Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by Young Harris College and the Richard Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Our guest today is former State Senator Jim Tysinger, who we're very happy to visit with today. Before we get into your service in the Georgia General Assembly, Senator, we'd like for you to tell us, if you will, a little bit about yourself, your family, and how you got involved in politics.
Okay. Well, I'm basically a native of North Carolina, grew up in Greensboro, but during the Depression, jobs were not easy, and my father got one in Washington, so we moved to Washington, D.C., and I went to high school in Washington, D.C. Couldn't go to college because then they didn't have student loans or anything. And so I joined the National Guard. I was always interested in the Army. Matter of fact, I wanted to go to West Point. So I joined the Guard because I could take a competitive exam for the Army. And at the same time, I was in the Army. I liked that portion of it. And I busted my physical for West Point because I had to wear glasses. And I didn't realize then you had to have 20/20 uncorrected vision. And we went in, I was in the unit that got mobilized early, in January of '41. And we went to Fort Bliss, Army career there. War was declared, we went to Birmingham and stayed up there. When they lowered the age limit to below 21, I applied for OCS and went to OCS and graduated in July, commissioned in July, and went to my first unit I was assigned to was a Georgia National Guard unit from Calhoun, Georgia. And we sailed for the Pacific in September. I was overseas for over 3 years. I served in the South Pacific, Southwest Pacific, Guadalcanal, New Guinea, Leyte, and Luzon, and came home after the war and went to Georgia Tech and ended up, first 3 years I was in the oil field and with Shell Oil Company. My daughter got polio. We moved back here to take her to Warm Springs because it's the best place to take her. So I came back in '42 and went with Westinghouse and as an engineer with them and retired from them.
How did you get involved in politics?
I got involved in the Goldwater campaign. I thought he was, I read about his background and enjoyed him. And so I got involved then just as a worker in the Goldwater campaign. And then from that got involved in the Dekalb, because the Goldwater campaign was, at that time, was no Dekalb Republican Party to speak of. There was a group in South Dekalb, Frank and those groups.
Frank Miller?
Frank Miller. And so I got involved with the Dekalb Republican Party, you know, as a precinct worker, putting up signs and all that. And finally I became a precinct chairman, but I was asked to run, and during Bo Calloway's campaign, I was asked to run for the House. They were looking for members, and I didn't have any money. And they promised to raise me $1,000, and I matched it with $1,000. And ran against Moody Malone, got defeated, because then it was a 4-man district covering almost all of DeKalb and all of Rockdale County. And it was difficult to get around, especially with the machine the 4 of them had all set up together. And then in the court decision, they made it that you couldn't have the 4-man district at that time. And the Senate was already a 1-man, 1-vote district. And during that time, I served on as a councilman for the old village of North Atlanta. Mac Conway, who was a senator, put a bill in for a constitutional amendment to do away with North Atlanta. I thought it was wrong. What it was behind it was developers who didn't like the zoning we were putting out. And so we lost that election, and North Atlanta was, they abolished. And so the next year, 2 years later, they asked me to run for the Senate. They wanted a candidate. Had some people lined up for the House. Bob Bell ran as one, Stan Collins, and Harry Tysinger. And so I ran for the Senate. Again, I didn't have any money to speak of. I got some donations, but looking at the money you spend today, I think I ran for less than $10,000 first time. But because I had a lot of friends and we had kind of an organization built up, that's where I won the election. And I beat Conway at that time. Had become an independent because he did not vote in the election for the governor when the General Assembly voted for governor. He did not. He said his people in the district didn't vote for Governor Maddox, and therefore he was going to vote the other side. The next time he ran as an independent, and I ran against him. It was a Democrat in the race. It was a three-man race. He was eliminated, and it was down to Democrat and I beat him in a runoff election, and which surprised me that I got that far. But anyway, I went in, and I was very fortunate that I was able to serve 30 years, that I had some terrific people supporting me, and it was 30 years. I hope that I've done something for Georgia. Well, I got a lot of it too.
You sure did. And I want to tell you, of all the public officials that I have known over my 50-odd years of being in and associated with Georgia government, I hold you in high esteem.
Well, you're grateful. I'm grateful for that. And
you've been a great public servant. But I would like to ask you this question. Why did you decide to be a Republican in a state that had been Democratic for 100 years?
Well, I'd always believed in the Republican philosophy. Some of that came really out of my father-in-law. When I came back, after the war, I didn't know anything about anything politically or maybe what's going on. I think the strangest sensation I had coming back when the ship got close to the United States, we started hearing the radio, and what the hell is going on with people with all those ads and stuff? But anyway, so I got interested in that way, in the philosophy and the part. I have to admit, when I was at Georgia Tech, we lived at Lawson Apartment, and there was an election there at that time, I voted, wasn't anything to do. I voted Democrat, and there was long paper ballots and so forth. But philosophically, that's what I believed in. And so that's why I became a Republican. And Barry Goldwater was the center of that, too.
So in your first term in the Georgia Senate, you were one of seven Republicans.
That's correct.
You had a Democratic governor and a Democratic lieutenant governor. Yeah. In those days, Senator, Georgia had probably the strongest governor system in the country.
That is correct. Well, actually, when Governor Maddox took over, Speaker Smith realized that they had elected him, and so Speaker Smith basically assumed a lot of the powers that previous governors had. As I understand it, that the previous governors would almost appoint who was going to be the speaker and who was going to be in the chairman position. And so Speaker Smith recognized this political thing and basically grabbed the power away from Governor Maddox. I think Governor Maddox was, I won't say he was naive, but I think Governor Maddox wanted to get along, and so he did not resist it as a Carl Sanders might have done it. And so then the power, basically more power shifted to the General Assembly. It became less of a strong government than we previously had.
What sort of committee?
On a few occasions, individuals did get calls to come down to the governor, explain the legislation to him.
Were you ever called down?
I was never called down.
What sort of committee assignments did you get from a Democratic Senate?
George Smith who was the other George Smith, was very, very, I think, fair. And my first assignment, in which I stayed the whole 30 years I was in, and I enjoyed it, was higher education. I had public utility, and I think I went on appropriations too that time. And later I under Governor Maddox, when he was lieutenant governor, I became chairman of science and technology, and that's one area I stayed in, dropped public utility as one of my assignments. But George Smith was fair, and I want to say one other thing. For the most part, the Democrats were very fair to me. I only recall one Democrat I would not put in that category, but basically they were very fair to me, and I cannot, you know, I think that that I was treated very well.
1970.
Yes.
1970 of that election, the Democrats were deciding whether or not they would nominate Carl Sanders or Jimmy Carter. As it turned out, Carter won, but the Republicans had a pretty hotly contested race between Atlanta newsman Hal Suit and Jimmy Bentley, who had left the Democratic Party and become a Republican. How did the Republicans feel about that switch?
Well, most of us knew Hal Suit because of his TV and thought he'd be the favorite character. I don't recall there was any animosity. They just favored Hal Suit. And if you know, he was a World War II veteran who wounded and handled himself very well. And so we went behind Hal Suit.
And that same year, Senator Frank Miller, who you mentioned earlier, was a candidate against Democrat Lester Maddox.
Yeah.
And Maddox won that one. How did you rate Maddox as a governor?
You know, he was very accessible. We could get in his office and talk to him. And that didn't happen under other governors later on, but we could get in and talk to him. He was fair. Earl Patton and I went down there. Georgia Tech was trying to raise some money to match the Callaway Foundation for the Student Center at Tech. And we down and talked to him, and I think if I remember right, we got $30,000 out of him to help us in that over there. And he was fair, and it was accessible. Always had a good humor about him.
How was he as lieutenant governor?
Same way. He was fair, and as I told, I believe that two senators basically influenced him and some of the decisions he made, and they were Gene Hawley from Augusta and Smith from down in Perry, Georgia. Smith was he was a rough person to deal with. And I think that in that position he had, I think he was Rules Chairman, I believe he was. And he was pretty rough on us. But Governor Maddox was, as even a lieutenant governor, was very fair. Because of Armstrong, Smith was close to him, as our Republican leader, I got a chairmanship out of him. I was chairman of the of Science and Technology. And Paul Coverdale became on retirement.
Recite for us, if you will, the constant feud between Governor Carter when he was governor and Lieutenant Governor Maddox when he was lieutenant governor.
Well, there was animosity to it, and the five of us at that time were Republicans because we had lost some seats. The five of us were really the swing vote, and we'd go with Governor Maddox or Governor Carter, which, as we wanted to. And I tell people I had more sandwiches and Cokes with Governor Carter downstairs in his office. And Governor Maddox was also through, not him directly, but through others were also votes. But and so we were the swing votes. But again, I said we were treated always fairly with the Democrats. I had many Democrats friends. Paul Brown down at Athens was one of the best friends I had in the Senate, as for example. And Bobby Rowan and these other, Frank was there. And so I think Governor Maddox, as Lieutenant Governor, did a commendable job.
Let's talk for a minute about some senators with whom you served. Hugh Gillis.
Hugh Gillis, low-keyed, but an individual who went into as I understand it, went into the House at the age of 25 and went through many of those periods of time, particularly when the General Assembly elected Governor Maddox, but other instances. He had a deep interest and always was chairman of natural resources and helped the natural resources of the state. That was one of his big things.
Bobby Rowan.
Bobby Rowan probably was the best stump speaker I've ever heard, and he could sway an issue like no one else. As I told you earlier, I recall one instance there was a dealing with the mobile homes going down the highways, and Bobby Rowan, in opposition to it, went into the well and made a speech as if he were from perspective of his young son traveling with him in the car, and said, "What's up, Daddy? Where's that going? How long are we going to be there?" And there was a mobile home in front of him. He did such a good job. He beat the measure. And Hugh Carter, who had mobile homes in his district, got so daggone mad. I mean, he was spitting mad about that one issue.
How about Paul Coverdale?
Paul was came in. He beat one of the, I won't say he was a leading Democrat, but a big Democrat here in the city. He was a friend of the bankers. And
Jack Hardy.
Jack Hardy. And I know Paul, remember one time went up to Mills Lane and asked Mills Lane for money, and Mills Lane's comment, "Well, you SOB, you're running against my best friend." Paul said he backed out of the room. But Paul was a tireless worker, and he, as I said, Governor Maddox made him a chairman of the retirement committee, and he took some steps to try to improve the retirement system and accountability in that. He was always very interested in things that were going on. And I think he was a real dedicated individual.
He was elected and re-elected to the United States Senate.
Yes.
I wonder what...
well, first, you ran for Congress and was defeated.
Defeated, yes.
But then he kept at it and ran for the United States Senate and was elected. And I ran into him on several occasions. He served in the Peace Corps too. I ran into him several occasions while I was doing that, but also as a senator. And Paul never took care of himself. He's energetic. He basically lived on coffee and peanut butter crackers, I think. And I chastised him about that one last time in Tulsa, that he better start taking care of himself. But he was energetic. He was all into it. He was very dedicated.
He took on a big task in facing an incumbent United States Senator who had the support of the Speaker of the House, Tom Murphy, and others. What was the Republican thinking at the time? Did you think he could win?
Well, I didn't, really honestly. I think that the turning coat was the exposure of the money in the overcoat pocket. And at that time, Herman had a few other things that he had lost, I think, many of the people in the state. That's my opinion. And I think Paul built on that. I think that was one of the factors that Paul won.
Bob Bell.
Bob Bell and I are good friends and have been. We went to the same church together. And as a matter of fact, Bob won the House when I went in the Senate. And later, when it was an opening, after reapportionment in '70, and they redrew lines and DeKalb County got more senators in here, Bob Bell ran for the 5th District and won. And as you know, later, after several years, he ran for governor against Joe Frank, and then dropped out of politics in general. But we're still good friends.
Good. Now let's talk for a minute about the lieutenant governors with whom you served. We mentioned Maddox
And George Smith.
And George Smith. Then there was Zell Miller.
Zell was, most of the time I was in the Senate, Zell was lieutenant governor. Again, I was treated fairly. Zell, at the latter part, I think he would have done it early if it had not been for some people like Holly and others. But Zell made me chairman of the Georgia World Congress Center Overview Committee, and I served in that for several years. But he was always accessible, and you go talk to him, and if you had a piece of legislation you're particularly interested in, and it wasn't something he would bitterly was in opposition to, he'd help you. So I have real fond memories of him.
You served, I believe, for one of your final term with Lieutenant Governor Mark Taylor.
Yeah. No, I was not.
You were not there?
Mark was the floor leader for Governor Maddox. I'm sorry, Governor Miller.
Speaking of Governor Miller, upon the untimely death of Senator Paul Coverdale, Governor Roy Barnes appointed him to the United States Senate as a Democrat, replacing a Republican. What was the reaction among Republicans to that?
I think they thought Zell would probably be the best person that he could put up there. Zell had never been at odds, I think, with goals that the Republicans wanted to achieve. And so there was no negative image of him. And they felt that was probably the best person they could put up there. And Zell got to Washington. Apparently he was exposed to some politics he didn't like, and he told them. He's written a couple of books about that. And I was fortunate that I went to the National Republican Convention when he made the speech at the National Republican Convention. And he got a standing ovation. It was outstanding.
Do you think there was any basic difference in the political philosophies of Coverdale and Miller?
That's an interesting point. And no, I don't. I think Paul might have been in certain areas. You know, he was one of those opposed to Hillary's health care. That was one of the big issues he was in, and he was in that. But philosophically, you know, I think there was a lot of similarity between the two and their outlook. I think Zell always had a very high opinion of Paul, and if I recall, Zell's comment when he took the position had something to do with, and I don't remember the exact words, but it came across to me, I'm going to carry out Paul's philosophy. That's what came back to me. That's what I interpreted.
Among your chairmanships of during your service in the Senate, you was also chair of the Metropolitan and Atlanta Area Rapid Transit Overview.
That's correct.
Committee.
And then later became on the MARTA Ethics Committee.
Tell us, if you will, Senator, about how the legislation that created MARTA was passed.
Well, MARTA was created by the legislature, and as you recall, it was a vote on the people of DeKalb and Fulton County voted for it for the 1 cent sales tax. And that was the issue that put MARTA into business. MARTA, however, I think politically was organized incorrectly. One of the things we had, the head of MARTA at that time was a hard-headed individual you couldn't even talk to. And I remember we in the Senate tried to get them to accept the railroad cars built down in Winder, Georgia, that were building for Washington, D.C. And they wouldn't do it. They wanted their own car, their own design, and went to France to buy them. And that upset some people. But Levitas, who was in the House then, I got upset to a degree. He was, actually at that time, he was chairman of MARTA. But he got upset with them because of the money they were spending, how they were spending it. So Elliott got 2 bills passed. One of them was that, I think it was, remember now what the percentage was, but a good percent of that money couldn't be used for fares, subsidizing fares, had to be used for construction. And they also passed legislation that the fare box had to bear more of the cost of the ride. And had it not been in that, MARTA would have gone broke a long time ago. And Elliott Levitas was one of, I think, farsighted enough to see where that the money was not being spent well. That director finally left and went to Houston. And MARTA then came. We were fortunate. We had Dan Patillo was one of the chairmen, and he was very aggressive in pushing it. We in DeKalb County got upset because legislation was passed to build Atlanta to the airport without coming into DeKalb County. And Dan went along with that, but he did build the first line from into Brookhaven and then on up. And then later, David Chestnut got in and did a good job too. So we were fortunate in DeKalb County. We had 2 good chairmen in that MARTA.
Originally, Cobb County opted out.
Cobb County opted out, and I don't recall, it might have been racial, I don't recall the reason, but DeKalb did and Fulton did. Now, one of the things that was tried for several years is to get the sales tax from the Atlanta airport included, which is probably now it'd be $2 or $3 million. And Clayton County since the airport's in Clayton County, would not allow that to take place because of some political questions between the chairman down there and then Maynard Jackson.
Let's talk now, if you will, for a minute or two about the rise of the Republican Party in Georgia.
Well, it was a slow process, but I think philosophically, as you pointed out earlier, many of the Democrats in this state were very conservative minded, and they didn't like some of the things taking place in Washington. I think that was the impetus. They didn't want to be identified with it. And so that slowly built. We were fortunate to have Paul was chairman of the Republican Party, I believe, during that period of time, and really worked to get the message across. And we slowly picked up seats. When I left, I think we probably had 15 or 16 Republicans when I got out. And then the impetus went over, and the Senate became Republican.
Did you think you would ever elect a Republican governor?
Well, we almost elected Bo Calloway, but you know, it was a question. I think I think the people of Georgia, as I said, were conservative, and they didn't like some of the things that Washington was doing, and basically some of the things Jimmy Carter did up there as president. And so I think that turned them against him. And I think that's why we picked up so many Republicans in the state.
Carter left office in Washington in a mess.
Yeah, what was interest rates? I mean, the gasoline was as high as it is getting up there. And matter of fact, it was a shortage, if you recall. You couldn't even get gasoline. And also the inflation was very, very high when he left.
Interest rates were high.
Interest rates were high. And so that, I think, was one of the factors that put Ronald Reagan in. Because Ronald Reagan he had both Democrat and Republican votes, and he went in.
Reagan Democrats, they called them.
Beg pardon?
Called them Reagan Democrats.
Blue Dog Democrats.
Blue Dogs, yes.
Matter of fact, the Wall Street Journal yesterday had an article about the Blue Dog Democrats still in existence. I think there were 37, 38 of them, and they were pushing the speaker up there. It wouldn't help on a bill because it was no tax or no money to offset spending she wanted, and they were insisting you balance. If you're going to spend some money, you make certain you got some money to spend, and don't just go in debt for it.
Some states have registration by party. What do you think of that?
I like Georgia's system, and that is you vote whatever you want to at times. Otherwise, we would have had a difficult time building a Republican Party.
But doesn't that allow cross-voting?
It allows cross-voting, and probably some of that's taking place. But I think that's, I know at times they made an issue of that. I didn't participate in that. But there is, and that's one of the weaknesses of that system. But I still believe you had the right to be an independent, or vote Republican, or vote Democrat, or vote Libertarian.
When we were talking earlier about some of your colleagues in the Senate, I failed to ask you about probably the most colorful one who ever served, a fellow named Culver Kidd.
Culver Kidd sat in front of me, and I'll say one thing about the positive thing about Culver, and that is Culver probably passed more legislation for departments of state government because they asked him to do it than any other senator. Culver would go out and have a liquid lunch and come back in, and he would, at one instance, he got to the well and spoke of a bill that was the next bill up, not the bill he was supposed to be. He got mixed up on his bills. He was a colorful individual. And one occasion, said he sat in front of me, and I went in the Senate, and there was a young woman sitting in that seat with a page button on. And I didn't wonder what the heck's going on. She was a nightclub owner or singer out here on Roswell Road. He brought her in for his page that day. I don't think.
Were you there?
That's Culver.
Were you there the day he wore his Crown Royal breeches?
Yes.
You remember that?
Yes. Culver was always a source. If you wanted some liquid refreshments, you'd go to Culver's office.
Well, you had the pleasure of serving with 6 governors.
Yes.
Let's talk for a minute about them. Of course, we mentioned Lester Maddox. He was governor during your early years. You served with Jimmy Carter. You went through the Carter reorganization legislation. And incidentally, that's been many, many years ago. Do you think that reorganization worked?
No, well, it worked in part. The biggest mistake was made, and I voted against it, was the Department of Health. He broke it up. We had Department of Health and part of mental health or something like that. And he broke that up. Now we have a department over there that you can't manage. It's too big, and they're constantly in the paper about children abused within the system, but it's too big. And that was one of the mistakes. I voted against that. Some of the others, we needed, but that was one big mistake.
How about George Busby?
Well, you know, George was a good governor. One of the things he started was and pushed was the concept of, while it's located on a tech campus, there was other people involved in it, and that is where you could have an incubator for businesses. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was a good idea, where you could have this place where a business could come in with under basically low rent and with help from the university system, start his business and then branch out on his own. I think that was one of the big steps that he made. But there were others. But he was a good governor too.
Did you support the lottery?
I did. Let me tell you this. I supported the concept of letting the people vote on it. That was the concept I went on. And the legislation that was passed was the right legislation, in the fact that it was restricted, if I recall the details, to 4 areas. One was for Hope Scholarship. One was for, I believe it was the kindergarten program. One was for scientific technical approach. If you recall, Governor Miller put dish antennas at each school and put computers in each school. And then the fourth thing was a reserve, so that if the funds were to decline, there'd be enough money to keep the Hope Scholarship going. And I think that's one of the big things that came out of that. And I think it was properly. I hope it doesn't. No one mends that. I think those are the areas you should go in. And I visited. One of the things I tried each year, not each year, but I tried to visit every school in the district I served. And I know I went into one up here at Nancy Creek, and I was asking them about what they were doing with the money they got from the governor. And I went in there, and they had a room full of computers that hadn't even been put into use. And I went over to the superintendent of schools and I complained about it, and the principal was basically relieved. But it was a good program. I went to schools in Gwinnett County, and they were using that program to bring science programs that they couldn't probably afford that kind of instruction. I remember one was from Arizona. It was excellent. So they're doing a good. I think they basically under Governor Miller, that was a right step in the right direction.
Of course, that was his main campaign issue, the lottery. So you would give him high marks overall as a governor?
I think it turned out well. As opposed to the way Florida did it. I mean, Florida put it in the general treasury. But this was, I think, well structured, and it's been good use. The Hope Scholarship has been one of the best things we've done in this state.
What do you think about earmarks in state government?
We don't have earmarks as such as they do in the federal government. You can't put an earmark on an appropriation item. It has to basically stay by itself. For example, I've gotten some money for parks, but it was done specifically spelled out. That's where it was going. I think it was, while it was, I think, completely disclosure, it's not hidden as it does in the federal government. It's disclosed. There's too much of that still going on in Georgia of giving, the money out. Usually, if you recall, what happens is the governor would make an estimate on the low side, and more money would come in. Mm-hmm. So when you come in for the amended budget, which was supposed to be just for, basically, the amended budget was to be for the school attendance and bring that up to, that's what required. If you have more students in, you need more money, then you don't know how many students you're going to have in until they register in September. But that was broadened out, and that issue was, and I voted against the budget several times because there were areas in that thing, the money was, while it went through a department, it was full disclosure. I just think it was wrong.
How do you rate Georgia's appropriations process? It seems that it always ends up the last 2 or 3 days. I think is a weakness. You spend all the time in appropriation meetings, and the House passes a bill and sends it to the Senate. And one of the things that disturbed me early on, the Speaker Smith would send the appropriation bill over to the Senate and did not give them enough time to really consider it and what was in it. If I recall, one of the conference committee's reports, we got it at 11:30, I think, on the last night, and we turned it down. And the House members in there were lined up along the side because they didn't want to come into special session. And we got commitments that there'd be certain corrections made to the Appropriations Committee, and so we reconsidered and passed it. But then that's why the Senate passed their rule that you had to have the appropriation overdone at a certain time. But I still think a lot of work needs to be done in that area. When you go in the conference committee report, basically the appropriation of Georgia is decided by 6 people. That's the conference committee report, and I think that it should be. They should not have that much power. The 6 people are going to make that decision because it comes back to you. They could change it completely the way you passed it, and you don't have enough time to really look into it. Getting back to the governors we were talking about, you also served with Roy Barnes.
Yeah.
What kind of governor was he?
Well, Roy was not governor when I was governor.
Oh, he wasn't?
When I was in the Senate. Roy was in the Senate with me, and was an outstanding senator. Again, he was an excellent individual to go in a well and explain something. He did it always with a sense of humor that he had. And if I recall, he ran for governor unsuccessfully, or ran for something unsuccessfully, and got out of the Senate, and later came back into the House. And then after I left, he ran for governor and won. Roy and I are good friends.
And you didn't serve with Sonny Perdue, but tell us what you think of him as a governor.
Well, Sonny and I are friends. And when he first came to the Senate, I perceived in my own mind that he was going to be a coming leader. And as a Democrat, he worked his way up. I said he got me on. If you recall, he had a special committee on gas deregulation, and he got me on that committee with him, and other committees, and so I was impressed with him. And then he became president pro tem of the Senate, and then I left. The one thing I think personally that why he became disenchanted and became a Republican was Charles Walker and the power he had picked up under Pierre Howard and some of the things he was doing, and it was others, but Charles Walker, he couldn't put up with that stuff, so that's why he changed.
Well, you've certainly had a very interesting career. As you look back over it, what is your fondest memory?
Oh, God, that's hard to separate those. And fondest memory. I just think that looking back, I hope one thing, as I said earlier, that I made some contributions to the state. One of the last pieces of legislation I handled, two of them, one of the last pieces of legislation I handled was the electronic transfer of signatures, which has been a bonus for Georgia and the legal profession and all legal documents. And the last thing is that when they closed Brook Run, working with Pierre Howard as lieutenant governor, we set that up. That's 100 acres in DeKalb County, over 100 acres. And the legislation provided for 70% green space, so they can't do anything out there restricted. And DeKalb County bought it, I think, for $2 million, and it's been a tremendous asset to our county.
Before I forget it, I want to ask you about your Tysinger breakfasts you used to have in DeKalb County.
Well, when Bob Bell and I and were in the General Assembly, I thought the idea that we should get together basically on a weekend basis. Bob Gould was in there and was DeKalb County commissioner and later became chairman. Harry Tysinger, and we had Joe Willingham, who was on the school board. But we should get together and talk about issues so that we'd all become familiar with what others were doing and maybe work together, coordinate our efforts together. We started off just having breakfast over here at the Holiday Inn, and other people started coming in and joining us. And it got kind of out of hand. They gave us a room on the side after breakfast. And then we transferred. We've been kicked out of every hotel in DeKalb County, I think, because the guys basically wanted to drink a cup of coffee rather than eat breakfast. And so the last thing happened is that the Republican Party wanted a better place. And we had been raising money as a breakfast fund. You contributed, I think, $3 or something like that. We were raising money for it, and had some money we set aside, and we had a yearly breakfast. I started as a president's dinner, and the reason I started that, the Atlanta newspapers came out with an article that said, "The Republican Party is dead in Georgia." That was the headlines. It made me angry. So I said, we'll have a Lincoln Day dinner, because that used to be the old Republican dinner time. We had it up here at the Marriott, and we had Phil Crane come down from be our speaker, and we had standing room only. And so we took the money and we had it set up just to pay some expenses, but we were approached by the chairman of the Republican Party for support. And while we were not aligned, it's not aligned Republican. It's so we can get judges and others to come to it, and Democrats to come to it. We promised that we would pay a portion of the monthly rent for the place if we were allowed to use it on Saturday morning. So we use the Republican headquarters building over Saturday morning, for which we pay roughly $500–600 a month for that opportunity. And we raise the money for it within our group. And since while we're in a Republican headquarters, and many of us are Republicans, it's structured so that we hear all of the judges. Not many places, they can't go to a partisan political place. So we get the judges in, we get other people in who are in school board races and all. We get people in from, I've had Sam Nunn come talk to us. We had other, and it's just I feel what we need to do is educate the people what's going on. They don't send newspapers, and you hear this direct from people, and it's been successful.
You've been a real hard worker for the party. Tell us, if you will, about some of the early hard workers in the Republican Party.
Well, there was a friend of mine was probably the leader when I went in, a fellow named Al Warrington. Al was with Arthur Anderson, was a partner of Arthur Anderson, later moved out of the state to Miami, and then ended up in Texas, where he went in, retired basically from Arthur Anderson, but went in the business and made a fortune out there to them. But Al was one of our early leaders, Al Warrington. And of course, Bob Bell was one of them, built the thing. Joe Willingham, who was on the school board, helped us. And Bob Gould did a lot to that area. These are some people who know out. Harry Tysinger and Stan Collins they come to some, but not many. Mm-hmm. But those are essential to the ones we're in there.
What do you see politically down the road? Do you think the Democrats can regain power in the state?
That's a good question. I think that they will gain some, but it's going to be a cycle for some time, I think, before they really gain the power. If you recall, the Democrat election on the county unit system was predicated on the sheriffs of the various counties, and they had this system. The sheriff was a big key person in each county. That's gone. And the other thing that the Democratic Party went into was a series of very liberal people, probably a lot of African Americans in there, and but I think it's a liberal concept more than anything else that they've got to change their concept and come back there, because many of the Democrats when I went in the Senate, had the same philosophy I did. Mm-hmm. Really did. I had many friends. Paul Coverdale, And Paul Brown, Bobby Rowan, Frank Eldridge, just to name some of them.
So you felt comfortable in the Senate even though you
I was
were
always
in
accepted as a senator.
minority. Pardon?
I was always accepted as a senator.
Yes, sir. Okay, now as you look back over your career, what has been your biggest disappointment?
Well, that's a good question too. I don't know whether I had any real disappointments. I think I was frustrated sometimes when I could get bills through the House, but not through the Senate. Through the Senate, but not through the House. And Speaker Smith had a system over there that bill come over, and they put it in a committee, and they put it in a subcommittee, and you had to work your way through a very maze to get through it. And if the Speaker didn't want it, it didn't get passed. So that was my biggest frustration. And many of the other senators the same way. They would pass bills, or good bills, and the Speaker didn't want it. That was it.
If you were asked to give a young, aspiring politician some advice, what would you tell him?
I'd tell him two things. One of them is you got to build up an organization, a bunch of friends. You cannot do it by yourself. And the second thing is, as today, you've got to build up enough financial support from friends to win the office. I think it's obscene the amount of money you have to spend for a House seat and a Senate seat today. I ran for $3,000 or $4,000. The most I ever spent was $60. And I had opposition. Stan Collins, he ran against me, was John Linder. And John had more money than I did, but I had the organization. And the people got out and worked, and that's how I beat John that time.
Since you have retired, you've still been active. In fact, you're on the board of Natural Resources.
That is correct. The governor put me on the board, signed me to the board on Natural Resources.
And you're now faced with a lot of problems. Water.
Well, for 2 years, there's been a study made, and it was approved in the last legislature, water plan for Georgia. If you recall, under Governor Maddox, he was trying to build 6 reservoirs in the state, which we'd have built them, we'd been ahead of the game. And we were sued by Florida and Alabama to stop that. There was one other one too. Under Governor Maddox, when he was governor, there was money set aside for a dam on the Flint River. Money was there, the plans were there, and then Governor Carter came in, took a canoe ride down there and stopped it. If that had been in there, that would have also been a big source of water for Georgia. What the department is encouraging now is that for each county and each municipality, if it's large enough, to set aside a reservoir of their own water. And that's happening over the state. We're having smaller ones. But we've suffered a drought period. Matter of fact, for 3 years we've had a serious drought condition and water restrictions. I think the Corps of Engineers now, I read this morning in a paper, they now are saying that the mussels show down in Florida can survive on enough water that's going through. We don't have to pour all the damn water down there. So I think we're on the basis. If we get some rain in North Georgia and fill the reservoirs back up, I think we'll be all right. We'd still have to watch ourselves and how we use water.
During your career, did you ever think of seeking a higher office?
At one time, and it was in frustration more than really looking at it. I felt I had my family to take care of, and I didn't have time and the money to go for a higher office. But I can't, my mind, you have to forgive me, my mind's blank. Pat Swindle. Pat Swindle was caught up in his last election.
He was a congressman.
He was a congressman. He was caught up in some questionable activity. And he sat right there, and we had others in here one night, and he lied right to us. And at that time, I was considering running against him because I didn't like what he was doing. But he sat there and said, lied like Dickens. They finally found him guilty. He lost the election to a nobody, really.
Ben Jones.
Ben Jones. But Jen wouldn't know anything except his television program.
The Dukes of Hazzard.
Yeah, but Pat just was not honest. And that's one time I was seriously thinking about running against him.
Well, you've certainly had a great, great career.
Well, that again, if I hope I've done anything for Georgia, helped in any way, that's my gratification.
And I want to thank you, Senator, on behalf of Young Harris College and the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia for being with us today.
Well, I'm glad we're trying to preserve some of history if I'm part of it.